Hi everyone, my name is Matt Williams. I'm the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Today I'm going to be talking about the admissions tests that we use as part of our process of deciding which students we are going to take as undergraduates. These tests are used for most of our degrees these days, and they're also used at many other competitive universities in the UK. So what I'll be saying will be of relevance to those of you applying not only to Oxford but also Cambridge and universities like Imperial and Manchester as well. Personally, I have experience as an academic for the past 10 years in Oxford, in particular working in the degree of Philosophy, Politics and Economics, or PPE, where we use what's known as the Thinking Skills Assessment Test, or TSA. But again, quite a lot of what I'll have to say about the tests generally don't just apply to the TSA, but to all of the tests. So I'm going to make my message as generic as possible and as relevant to everyone as I can. So first of all, I am going to talk through the what, when, why and how of admissions tests for universities like Oxford. So first of all, what are the tests? We use a variety of tests, but they all have a common theme, which is that they test the way you think as opposed to the stuff that you know. So you can't revise for these tests as you might revise for your school exams, in the sense that you need to acquire a certain amount of knowledge in order to get through the exam successfully. What you're really doing is testing your skills and honing those skills. And you can practice for these tests, but you can't, in practical terms, revise for them very easily. So that's the sort of, broadly speaking, the what. They're tests of how you think as opposed to what you know. But they nonetheless come in a variety of formats. So the maths aptitude test has a lot of mathematical puzzles to be solved, and the geography admissions test has a range of numerical and verbal reasoning tests, and the classics aptitude test is mostly verbal reasoning. So it does of course depend on the degree you're applying for, but the general message is that these are tests of your skills as opposed to your knowledge. So that is the what. The when is very important. This is 2019 as we're currently recording it, and most of our tests this year will be taking place on the 30th of October, but that date changes each year and it may be different for different tests. And you can take these tests anywhere in the world, so you need to make sure at what time and on what day you may have to take a particular test. It's very important to deal with some of the practical logistics of the test taking early, so that it's not something that you're scrambling to do at the last minute in a great panic. What typically happens is that your school will become the test centre and will administer the test for you, and so you need to collaborate with your teachers in order to make sure you can sit the tests in good time and have somebody invigilate you. This is extremely important. If any of this doesn't take place, if you're not registered to take the test, and if you don't sit the test at a registered test centre, your test will not be accepted, and that will almost certainly mean the end of your application to Oxford or wherever else you're applying to. So it is extremely important to make sure that all of those practical logistics are dealt with in good time, and it's probably worth looking into as soon as possible. I know of some people that have taken the test overseas outside of the UK, and that's perfectly feasible, but again it's just a question of ensuring that you have all the practicalities ironed out in good time so that you can get it sorted. It's even possible to take the test at a British embassy or a British consulate in other countries. So there are various ways you can solve the problems that you might encounter with regard to the test, but it's obviously best to start early to ensure that those problems are most manageable. So that's the what and the when. Now I think it's fair to understand a bit more about why. Why do we at Oxford and other competitive universities use admissions tests? Is this an opportunity for us to cruelly impose on people that have already done lots of exams another hurdle towards their getting to a university of their choice? Is this just something that we want to use as a stumbling block for people from, in particular, the most disadvantaged backgrounds? Well, no, of course not. The real reason that we have tests is precisely to ensure that people from less privileged backgrounds have more opportunities to show off their skills. Imagine a situation where we didn't use tests and we relied solely on state examinations. So that in the UK would mean A-levels or international baccalaureate or whatever other high school qualifications you're taking. If that was the only source of information we relied upon to gauge the academic ability of prospective applicants, then that would tend to be to the advantage of people who've been to very good schools and come from privileged backgrounds. So the reason we have tests is so that we can have more data, and in particular useful data about how people think, in order to level the playing field a little bit more. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind when you're taking these tests. They're not intended to trip people up. They're certainly not intended to discourage people from poorer and less advantaged backgrounds. In fact, the tests are intended to do precisely the opposite. So that's why we have them. The other reason, of course, is that we get a lot of exceptional applications from a highly competitive pool, and it's useful under those circumstances to have as much data as possible. And the admissions tests are particularly useful data, much of which we don't necessarily get from A-levels or IB or whatever else you may be taking at high school. So those are the reasons why we use the test. Now, how do we use the test? When I'm looking through applications for a subject that we offer here at Oxford, how do I slot the information I take from the test with all of the other information that we have from your application? So that would include your school results, if you have them yet, or your predicted results. That would include a reference that you've written about yourself in your personal statement on the UCAS form. That would include statements written by your teachers about you. That will include information about the type of school you've been to and where in the country or where in the world you come from. So we have quite a lot of data. How do we use the admissions test as a piece of data, or data, I should say? We use it to form a holistic picture of you. So what we're not going to do is just look at the test result and ignore everything else. So let's say you get an exceptionally good or an exceptionally bad test result. That doesn't, on one hand, mean you'll definitely get in, nor does it mean you definitely won't get in, because we use the information along with the other information that we have to form a full picture of you as a candidate and as an individual. It is the case that people that score in the top 25% of all the test takers in a given year have a higher chance of being invited to an interview at Oxford, and therefore have a higher chance of being admitted as undergraduates. But it is in no way guaranteed that if you get into the top quartile, that top 25% of test takers, that you will get in. And as I've mentioned, it also doesn't mean that if you come in the bottom quartile, you definitely won't get in. What we'll do is we'll find out why you came in the bottom quartile. It may be that the test itself was disturbed. It's not unusual for people while they are taking the test to have some sort of disruption going on. It might be a fire alarm going off, it might be a real fire going on around them. Various things have happened in the years that we've been running these tests, so we're not unused to unusual situations where students have been disrupted whilst trying to take these tests. So if that's true for you, you need to make sure that you communicate that to your teachers and that they communicate it to us. So that would be via the admissions officer at whichever college you're applying to. So that's one reason why sometimes a poor performance on the test will not necessarily be destructive of your application. Another situation may be because you come from a particularly underprivileged background. It may be that you have had various disruptions in your home or family life, and therefore taking the test was more difficult for you than it may have been for other people. Again, that can be useful for us to know. We don't need to know any details that you wouldn't wish to share, but if you think and if your teachers agree that it's relevant that your personal life had affected your performance in the admissions test, then again, that's something that it can be very useful for us to know. So there are various ways that we look at the admissions test score. But as I've already hinted at, what we tend to do for many of the degrees is that we split the cohort taking the test into quartiles. So in the top 25%, second 25%, third and fourth. And the top 25% are the ones that will be most likely to be invited to interview. But as I say, it's not deterministic, and we do look at the admissions tests along with all of the other data we take to produce a full, rounded picture of each of our applicants. I'm speaking from personal experience that it takes a long time and a lot of energy and a lot of effort, but we take it extremely seriously because we want to make sure we make the right decisions on admissions, and that means that we need to make sure we don't miss people who may not have a completely flawless school report. They don't necessarily have perfect grades at school, but they could nonetheless be an amazing talent that's perhaps developed a bit more slowly than other people, or has developed despite various disadvantages in their life. So that's how we use tests, that's why we use tests, that's also what the tests are and when they take place. So how can you best prepare for admissions tests for universities like Oxford? There are, to my mind, 3 P's that are particularly important, and they are physiological preparation, psychological preparation, and practical preparation. So starting off with physiological preparation, physiological refers to preparing yourself and your body to take a test like this. Now that might sound a little bit odd, but I think it can actually be very important. So in my experience of admissions for the degree of philosophy, politics and economics, the margin of difference between someone that comes in the top 25% of test takers and the second 25% of test takers sometimes comes down to less than 1%. So it's tiny, tiny margins of difference. And that difference could, in some cases, no doubt be explained by how tired one person was relative to another. It could be explained by how alert an individual was feeling as a result of the food intake they'd had or how hydrated they were. I think this is something that teenagers often neglect, is how are they in their body preparing themselves to take quite a rigorous test. Now, it's worth noting that I'm not trying to patronise anyone here. This is certainly something that I used to neglect as a teenager, so in many ways I'm just talking to myself as a 17, 18-year-old who didn't used to look after my body terribly well. But I increasingly realise that there is a tight fit, a tight correlation between the fuel I use to keep myself going and the amount of sleep I have and the performance that I get out at the end of the day. And it's fairly obvious and intuitive, but it amazes me day by day how much of a difference it has made to my life. So first of all, you need to make sure that you're getting a sufficient amount of good regular sleep. So that means about 7 or 8 hours and at the same times as far as possible on each night. What happens if you don't get those regular patterns of sleep is that you effectively put yourself into a situation of having jet lag and you don't get into the proper circadian rhythms of sleep, which is when your brain truly rests. If you don't have that on a sustained basis, then your brain and your body will become simply exhausted. So it's extremely important to make sure you have good sleep. Now, of course, there's a lot going on in your lives at this stage. Not only have you got all of your schoolwork, but many of you will have active extracurricular lives, you may have active social lives, so there's a lot going on. But it's nonetheless very, very important to make sure you get good regular sleep, because that, perhaps more than anything else, will affect your performance. There's a simple reason why sleep deprivation is one of the most continuously used forms of torture in human history. It's because it's extremely effective at breaking someone's will to carry on. Now, we're not talking about going to that extreme, but even moderate sleep deprivation can have quite detrimental effects on people's performance. Linked to sleep, of course, is nutrition. Your brain is an exceptionally energy-hungry organ. I've heard various estimates, but it's somewhere in the region of about 40% of your daily calorie intake is used by your grey cells. That's an extraordinary proportion, and it stands to reason that if you are using your brain an awful lot, that calorie intake will need to at least stay the same, if not increase. So this sort of time in your lives is not a good time to be going on a diet, and you need to think about the sort of foods that will help your brain work at its optimum. So that is very vitamin rich foods. Vitamins like B12, C, D are particularly important. There are various oils like omega oils which are important as well. If you're pursuing a vegetarian or a vegan diet, that's absolutely fine. You can find foods that are particularly high in these various vitamins. There are also some foods that are fortified with vitamins for vegetarians and vegans. And it's also, of course, possible to supplement your diet with vitamin tablets, but if you go to that position, it's good to take advice from a professional who can advise you as to what is best to take. But the essential point is that your brain needs calories, and your brain needs good vitamin-rich food in order to operate at its best. Now again, this might sound slightly odd to prepare for a test by thinking about what you eat, but I can't imagine a single athlete heading off to the Olympics who would not be thinking absolutely ruthlessly and carefully about everything they put in their body. Now, I'm not trying to say that coming to Oxford is akin to going off to the Olympics. It's not that degree of competitiveness, but it's not that far off either. And so if you want to make sure you have as much of a competitive advantage as possible, you need to think about all the things around your academic life as well as the academic life itself. So nutrition is exceptionally important. And the third part of the physiological aspect of preparation is hydration. The brain, as well as requiring lots of calories and vitamins, requires water to work. And if you're dehydrated, it can significantly impair your judgment. So you need to make sure that you're drinking sufficient water to just make sure that your basic physiological processes are operating properly. So that is also an essential part of the story as well. So that's the first P, physiological preparation. Are you ready in your body to take a test such as the ones that we are asking you to take? The second P is psychological preparation. So this is preparation of your mind, your attitude to taking a test. Now what is important here is that you are kind to yourself. What we often find is that people have a narrative about themselves in their mind that they aren't good enough, that they're not a very exceptional talent, that they're not a particularly important or interesting person, and they allow that narrative to just keep rolling round and around inside their head. And then every now and then they'll pick up a piece of evidence that they think reinforces that story that they have about themselves. And now I'm again saying that because that's the sort of story that tends to go around in my head, and it's extremely common amongst the people here in Oxford to be quite hard on themselves and perhaps have low self-esteem. But at some point, if you want to excel in a difficult test, you need to make sure that you don't just psych yourself out. You don't, from the start of the process, think, well, this is a waste of my time and energy because I'm simply not good enough. Many of the tests that we're asking you to take are exceptionally difficult. Again, they're not difficult because we are cruel people and we like to be unpleasant to teenagers on a systematic basis. They are difficult because we need to distinguish between extremely good candidates. And what will often happen is that students will start taking a test, either on the test day itself or in practice, and they'll look at the questions and just think, this is going way over my head, I can't understand any of this, and they start to get those thoughts in their head that they are the problem, that they are a bad person, that they are a stupid person, and that the reason the test is hard is because there's something wrong with them. Now that is very, very unlikely to be the case, and it's simply that the test is tough and it stretches everybody. In my history of marking the tests for PPE degrees, for philosophy, politics and economics, I've never seen anybody get 100%, and I must have seen thousands of test takers try and get as good a mark as possible. So these tests are extremely difficult, and they are designed to discriminate between exceptionally talented people. And the chances are that if you made the decision to apply to a university like Oxford or Cambridge or Imperial or wherever, that you are an exceptionally talented person as well. And you need to make sure that you're kind to yourself so that you don't waste nervous psychic energy in an exam just thinking, I'm finding this hard because I'm the problem, because there's something wrong with me. You just need to take a deep breath, keep your cool, keep calm, and just keep going, and not psych yourself out too much. It's completely normal and understandable to be nervous when taking a test like that. If you're not nervous, that's fine, that's not abnormal per se, but it's the most common response to a test like this is to be slightly nervous. That's fine. What is more problematic is if you take that feeling of nervousness to an extreme point where you think that you can't go on. And that's the sort of attitude that you need to try and prevent. And one of the best ways of preventing that mindset is the third P, which is practice. If you go through past papers of of which there are many for all of the tests available and easy to find online, you will see after a few iterations, after a few tries, that you get the sort of questions that are likely to come up. You understand the timing constraints of the paper and how best to manage your time through a test. You'll know what sort of tricks the examiners may use to try and pull various bits of information or various skills out of you. So just through practice, you'll start to feel much more comfortable. If, for instance, any of you are drivers, or if you're planning to take your driving test, if you tried to take the driving test having never practiced it, you would obviously be nervous and you would probably perform very badly, partly because you have no practical skills and partly because you are nervous. Well, it's similar for any test. The more times you try and practice going through the motions, the more it just becomes almost like muscle memory, that taking the next test will feel much more comfortable. And there's a marginal return for every time you take and practice a test, you'll feel a little bit more comfortable about the next test. So I would suggest you go through as many past papers as you can. Again, that will have to be slotted into the rest of your life and the various other time constraints that you will no doubt have. But given that these admissions tests are an important part of our admissions decisions, it is time invested. And also, as I've mentioned, the margin of difference between people that come in the top 25% and those that come in the second or third quartiles is often wafer thin. So if you are just able to take a little bit more of a step further forward than another person, then that could make the difference between coming to Oxford or Cambridge or wherever and not. So I highly recommend that you practice and practice and practice again. And when you're getting bored of practice, that means you're almost there, but then you should practice it once more, to the point where you're exceptionally familiar with the type of questions that are likely to come up, and that you've given yourself the time and space to talk through any particular problems you may have with a teacher, with a family member, with a guardian, with a friend, with whomever, so that you feel better, you feel more prepared, so that when you turn over that test paper on the day, it's not going to be a shock to you what's coming up. So those are my 3 Ps. Physiological preparation, prepare yourself in your body. Psychological preparation, prepare your mind. And practical preparation, just get yourself used to the tests, and that will help you be calm and be effective on the test day. So when it comes to actually taking the tests, what advice do I have to you for maximising your performance to do as well as possible? Well, of course, it's difficult to generalise across a wide range of test types and subjects, but I think there is one piece of general advice that I have certainly seen as very important for the thinking skills assessment and various other tests that I've been involved with, which is discipline. And what I mean by discipline is being absolutely sure that you're doing what you've been asked and not just doing what you think you wish you'd had been asked, and deciding what to do for yourself. So, for example, one part of the thinking skills assessment is an essay question in which students have half an hour to answer some fairly broad questions. One of the ones in the past is, when, if ever, is forgiveness wrong? When, if ever, is forgiveness wrong? Now that's a difficult question, it's a really interesting and rich question, and you've only got half an hour to come up with some sort of answer to it. But one of the most common things to see is that students do not answer it. They answer a different question. They talk about something similar to forgiveness or wrongness, but they don't stick to the actual wording of the question, and they just start to veer quite heavily away from the point of the question. Now, I would say that that was the experience I had in well over 50% of the essays that I read on that topic. So it's extremely common for people to be very poorly disciplined. Now that's the essay question, but it also pertains to the other parts of the exam. There are, for instance, lots of multiple choice questions in the thinking skills assessment, and the examiners asked quite specific questions. But what quite often happens, especially as students get fatigued towards the end of a test, is that they start to ignore or underplay the importance of what they've been asked, and they lose sight of particular details. So it's very important to make sure you know what you've been asked and you're providing the information in order to provide an answer. So it's worth looking very carefully at the questions, perhaps even before you start reading any other explanatory material. You could underline certain words within the question that you think are particularly important. That's a very sensible idea, because then you'll be sure to focus your attention on that part of the question that you really need to provide answers to. Now, you may be thinking that this sort of advice won't pertain to, say, a maths test or physics, but I would suggest that it does. Again, just making sure that you're disciplined can be a very important way to focus your energy. Rather than looking at a puzzle and allowing your brain to spill out all sorts of possible solutions, you go through it systematically. You work out, how much time do I have to answer this question? How much time can I realistically spend on it? How strong am I at this particular skill? Is this something that I'm very good at and therefore I should take a little bit less time on? Or is this something that I tend to struggle with, in which case it's reasonable for me to stretch my time constraints with the thinking that I'll have some time that I can make up later on? And how do I go about systematically answering this question? How should I break down its various components into a form that I can work with and that I can then reconstruct into a clear answer? If you just look at a puzzle in maths or in politics or in English or any subject, and you just allow your brain to spool out all of the various different possible stuff you know about that subject without ordering it, without being systematic, without being disciplined, then you will struggle to perform at your best. So my general bit of advice to be the best test taker you can be is to be disciplined, to be almost like a Shaolin monk with a particularly expert skill. You're not just someone who has this extraordinary amount of energy that just flies out in all directions, it's focused energy. If someone's asked you, when, if ever, is forgiveness wrong, if you do not use the word forgiveness or wrong in your answer, you are not answering the question. It's really as simple as that. You must be disciplined. And it breaks my heart when I look at the tests of exceptionally talented individuals who've thrown away a lot of marks through simply not being sufficiently disciplined, through just having unfocused energy and not using their skills to the best of their ability. So although it's a generic comment and it's something that is perhaps I'm using to stretch across a lot of different subjects, I think it does pertain. Be disciplined and you'll be effective. So just to finish off, I really want to emphasize that your decision to take an admissions test for one of the world's most competitive universities is a really exceptional thing to do. That you should be very proud of yourself to even be in this position of being a prospective test taker. That what happens in the test will hopefully reflect your abilities, and in most cases it does that well and effectively. It may not for various reasons, and if that's the case for you, if you think the test went wrong for various good reasons, then you can let us know and we can see about whether we can use some other information to determine your application. But the essential point is, as I mentioned previously, be kind to yourself. You are already doing something that's absolutely exceptional, that fewer than 1% of the people in this country will ever do. And you should be exceptionally proud of yourself and what you've achieved and what you've done to get to this stage. I'm sure that the people around you are very proud of you. I'm sure they're gunning for you. And they will of course think, as I do, that what happens in this test doesn't, in the grand scheme, matter a great deal. If you get through and come to a university like Oxford, then that could be great, that could be good for you. But if you don't end up coming to a university like Oxford, it's not likely to matter. In fact, it's worth reminding you that given how strong you are, almost certainly academically, you will succeed wherever you end up. And it's not going to help you if you put an extraordinary amount of pressure on your shoulders in order to get into a particular university. So be kind to yourself, be proud of yourself, and remember that whatever happens from now is a bonus, and you already deserve to be extremely proud. Thank you.